The Science, Space, and Technology Committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Before we start today, I'd like to recognize our clerk, Deborah Samantar. After 30 years of service in the House of Representatives, Deborah will retire at the end of this month. She has been a valuable member, and she is sitting in front of us in pink if you need to be reminded. She has been a valuable member of the Science Committee staff for many years and has clerked under 3 different Science Committee chairmen, beginning with Representative Bart Gordon in 2007. Deborah started her career in the House working for her home representative from Pennsylvania, Congressman Joe Coulter. After a few years, she became an intern and fellowship coordinator for the Committee on Education and the Workforce. I think that was under John Boehner, wasn't it, in part? She held many positions during her 20 years with the Education and Workforce Committee and worked under 5 different chairmen. This is an impressive record by anyone's standards, and not many people can claim such an achievement. Deborah's ability to communicate, her attention to detail, and dedication to the Science Committee and the House of Representatives will be missed. We thank her for her contributions to this committee and to our country. Deborah, we will miss you, and we wish you the best on your well-deserved retirement. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, for her comments.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like also to wholeheartedly congratulate Deborah for her 30 years of service in the House. I first met her 7 years ago when she became the clerk of the committee under Chairman Gordon. I've always known her to be a consummate professional and dedicated staff person to the committee. 30 years is quite some time. I'd point out that Deborah has been working in the House longer than both myself or Chairman Smith have been here. And I hope that in retirement, Deborah will be able to spend more time with her mother in Pennsylvania and traveling to her favorite vacation spots in the Bahamas. After 30 years of service to the House, I think you deserve a little fun in the sun. Thank you for all that you've done for the committee and for the nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. We will now move on to the committee's official business of the day, and the clerk, Deborah, will call the roll to establish a quorum.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you all very much. Okay. Chairman Smith.
Present.
Chairman Smith is present. Mr. Sensenbrenner. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall's present. Mr. Roybacher. Mr. Roybacher's present. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Nagelbauer. Mr. McCall. Mr. McCall is present. Mr. Brown.
Here.
Mr. Brown is present. Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Brooks.
Here.
Mr. Brooks is present. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Bouchon. Mr. Bouchon is present. Mr. Stockman.
Here.
Mr. Stockman is present. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey is present. Ms. Loomis. Mr. Swikert. Mr. Massey.
Present.
Mr. Massey's present. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Bridenstine.
Present.
Mr. Bridenstine is present. Mr. Weber. Mr. Stewart. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson's present. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Lofgren's present. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski's present. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards present. Ms. Wilson. Ms. Wilson is present. Ms. Bonamisi. Ms. Bonamisi's present. Mr. Swalwell.
Present.
Mr. Swalwell's present. Mr. Maffei.
Here, present.
Mr. Maffei is present. Mr. Grayson.
Present.
Mr. Grayson's present. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy's present. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters is present. Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Kilmer is present. Mr. Barra. Mr. Barra is present. Ms. Esty. Ms. Esty's present. Mr. Vesey. Mr. Vesey's present. Ms. Brownlee. Ms. Brownlee's present. Mr. Takano.
Are there any other members who wish to record their presence? If not, the clerk will report. Oh, the gentleman from Mississippi is...
Mr. Palazzo.
Here.
Mr. Palazzo's present. How many do you have? Mr. Chairman, there's 28 members present.
A working quorum is more than present, and pursuant to Committee Rule 2F and House Rule 11-2H4, the Chair announces that he may postpone roll call votes on matters in which the yeas and nays are ordered until the end of the markup. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 756, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2013, for markup, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 756, a bill to advance cybersecurity research, development, and technical standards and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member. The first bill for today's markup is H.R. 756, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2013. I thank Representatives McCall and Lipinski for introducing this bill, and I'm pleased to be a co-sponsor. As our reliance on information technology expands, so do our vulnerabilities. Cyber attacks against U.S. government and private sector networks are on the rise. Protecting America's cyber systems is critical to our economic and national security. Keeping our cyber infrastructure secure is a responsibility shared by different federal agencies, including the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The Cybersecurity Enhancement Act coordinates research and development activities to better address evolving cyber threats. The legislation promotes much-needed research and development to help create new technologies and standards that better protect America's information technology systems. To improve America's cybersecurity abilities, this bill strengthens activities in 4 areas. 1, strategic planning for cybersecurity research and development needs across the federal government. 2, basic research at NSF, which we know is important to increasing security over the long term. 3, NSF scholarships to improve the quality of the cybersecurity workforce. And 4, improved research, development, and public outreach organized by NIST related to cybersecurity. These are modest but important changes that will help us better protect our cyber networks. Cyber attacks threaten our national and economic security. To solve this problem, America needs a solution that involves the cooperation of many public and private sector entities. This legislation helps foster such an effort, which will make our computer systems more secure. Many industry partners and stakeholders have written letters in support of this bill. They include the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers, Tech America, Computing Research Association, Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers USA, Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, Financial Services Roundtable, and the U.S. Public Policy Council of the Association for Computing Machinery. I'm glad this is a bipartisan effort and look forward to this bill becoming law. I'll yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, the author of the bill, along with Mr. Lipinski.
I thank the chairman and ranking member for allowing me to proceed with this bill one more time. Mr. Lipinski, I believe this is the 3rd time we've introduced this legislation. I hope the 3rd time is the charm. But I do think it's important, and I appreciate how seriously the committee is taking this issue. It's of paramount importance for our country and our Congress right now. Earlier this week, our country's top intelligence official told a Senate panel that the United States is vulnerable to espionage, cybercrime, and outright destruction of computer networks, both from sophisticated and state-sponsored attacks as well as criminal hacker groups and cyber terrorists. Many of these attacks emanate out of China, Russia, and Iran. Yesterday in the Homeland Security Committee, in which I chair, the DHS Deputy Secretary, Jane Lute, again affirmed the need for Congress to develop legislation to address this critical issue. We know that foreign nations are conducting reconnaissance on our critical infrastructures and utilities, including our gas lines and water systems and energy grids. And if the ability to send a silent attack through our digital networks falls into our enemies' hands, this country could be the victim of a devastating attack. Last December, Iranians attacked the state-owned Saudi Aramco with the goal of stopping Saudi Arabia's oil production. Additionally, this year, Iran conducted multiple denial-of-service attacks on major U.S. banks in the United States. Hackers have also attacked our servers, the servers of our air traffic control system. And just last year, an al-Qaeda operative issued a call for an electronic jihad against the United States, comparing our technological vulnerabilities to that of our security before 9/11. Yet while threats are imminent, no major cybersecurity legislation that would help protect us has been enacted since 2002. Simply put, we are not prepared to meet the threats of the 21st century. Last month, the President issued an executive order with the intention of bolstering our cyber defenses because Congress has failed to take action. That is why Congressman Lipinski and I introduced the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2013 before this committee today. This act improves coordination in the government, providing for a strategic plan to assess the cybersecurity risk and guide the overall direction of federal cyber research and development. Our federal networks are under cyber attack every day. This bill updates the National Institutes of Standards and Technology responsibilities to develop security and procurement standards for the .gov computer systems to harden these federal networks against attack. Our bill also establishes a federal university private sector task force to coordinate research and development. It improves the training of cyber professionals and continues much-needed cybersecurity research and development programs at the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. Additionally, this bill promotes cybersecurity awareness and education throughout the country. And when you talk to agencies like the NSA, they tell you that perhaps 80% of this could be prevented by proper computer hygiene. Through a bipartisan effort, this bill passed last Congress, 395 to 10. Most importantly, H.R. 756 is fiscally responsible. It is not being paid with any new money, since it is intended to work within the boundaries of funds authorized and appropriated to NSF and NIST. This bill has been endorsed by leading industry groups, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Computing Research Association. We have also been working closely with NSF and NIST to ensure this bill suits their needs. I'm confident this legislation will advance the work these agencies are doing to bolster our domestic cybersecurity, and I urge my colleagues to support the legislation. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. The gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, the ranking member, is recognized for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Smith. Today we are marking up two bipartisan pieces of legislation. H.R. 756, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2013, and H.R. 967, Advancing America's Networking and Information Technology R&D Act. Advances in network and information technology, or NIT, are a key driver of our economy, increasing productivity in existing industries and opening the door for the formation of new ones. Small businesses use NIT to connect a wider consumer base, allowing them to grow. The military uses of NIT to improve intelligence gathering and sharing as well, to support many of its worldwide operations. NIT is improving healthcare by creating better treatment options through electronic health record keeping, advanced surgical tools, and the facilitation of medical research. And of course, internet companies such as Google and Facebook are now worth billions of dollars and show how quickly NIT R&D can translate into real-world products. NIT has truly revolutionized our modern way of life. However, our growing reliance on NIT to fuel our society leaves us vulnerable to cyber attacks. As the stakes have grown higher, individual hackers have given way to organized criminal groups and even foreign governments. It is not an overstatement to say that the increasing threat of cyber attack puts both our NIT-based economy and our national security at risk. Today we consider bills to address both those good and bad aspects of our high-tech society's growing reliance on information technology. The first bill, H.R. 756, addresses the growing threat of cyber attack. I want to commend Mr. Lipinski and Mr. McCall for their long-standing bipartisan leadership on this critical topic of cybersecurity research and development. The bill they have reintroduced is identical to the legislation we moved through this committee and passed overwhelmingly on the House floor last Congress. This bipartisan bill is overall a very good bill that contributes in essential ways to any comprehensive effort to keep our nation, our businesses, and our citizens safe from malicious cyber attacks. While H.R. 756 is a good bill, I think it is important that we consider the fact that the research accounts of both NSF and NIST would be flat funded under this proposal and were cut under sequestration. The federal government is already suffering from a lack of adequately trained cybersecurity professionals, and the impact of sequestration on these key agencies will further erode the human capital we need to build up our cybersecurity capabilities. It will also slow down much-needed advances in research and development on potentially game-changing technologies. Next, we will consider H.R. 967, which is another good bipartisan bill. It continues to strengthen and build upon the interagency initiative launched more than 20 years ago with the High Performance Computing Act of 1991. H.R. 967 is an updated version of a bipartisan bill that former Chairman Bart Garden first introduced and the House passed in 2009. The bill was developed by Chairman Garden to ensure that the federal government creates a coherent vision and strategy for federal investments in NIT R&D, including all of the applications made possible by NIT. The bill also contains provisions that would help facilitate and strengthen public-private partnerships for the benefit of our economy, national security, and overall quality of life. I'm proud to work closely with Chairman Hall. I was proud to work closely with Chairman Hall last year to update that legislation to appropriately reflect changes both to the NIT program and to the networking and information technology landscape since 2009. While it is not possible to get the NIT legislation enacted into law in the 112th Congress, I want to thank Ms. Loomis for reintroducing our bipartisan bill once again in this new Congress, and I'm happy again to be an original co-sponsor for this measure. With that, I will close by saying that I'm looking forward to a productive markup today, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. If there's no further discussion on the bill, I'll recognize myself to offer a manager's amendment, and the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 009, amendment to H.R. 756 offered by Mr. Smith of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and I'll recognize myself and then the ranking member. This manager's amendment makes a number of modest changes to the programs authorized in H.R. 756. First, the amendment supports coordination cybersecurity research and development. It assigns the University Industry Task Force the responsibility of identifying and prioritizing grand challenges for cybersecurity R&D. This will help the public sector become more aware of long-term industry needs and give more focus to public-private R&D efforts. The amendment also requires the cybersecurity R&D agencies to track ongoing and completed federal cybersecurity R&D projects and make that information publicly available. For the last several years, the Government Accountability Office has recommended this requirement in order to make federal cyber R&D more transparent and ensure we do not duplicate efforts. The amendment also improves NIST's Cybersecurity Awareness and Education Program. It directs NIST to include cybersecurity educational programs and federal workforce professional development in its activities. And I thank Ranking Member Johnson for her ideas that were included in this section. In addition, the amendment helps graduates of the Scholarship for Service program. It modifies the federal hiring authority available to these graduates to allow for expedited hiring and improved retention of these individuals in the federal workforce. Finally, the manager's amendment updates the authorization levels provided to the National Science Foundation Cybersecurity Research and Education grants. These programs have not been authorized since 2007. Since that time, the NSF has increased its activities to address cybersecurity. The authorizations proposed in this amendment are approximately equal to what NSF currently spends on these activities and sets that level for the next 3 years. The amendment also clarifies that this funding does not increase the total authorization for NSF's research activities. These authorizations demonstrate strong congressional support for prioritizing cybersecurity R&D activities that are important for America's security and competitiveness. This amendment improves an already strong bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. And the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, is recognized for her comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to Mr. McCall for working with me to update and improve Section 204 to better reflect the goals and status of federal cybersecurity education and dissemination activities. The federal science agencies support important education and training efforts, such as the Scholarship for Service program at NSF, that are helping to create a cadre of skilled cybersecurity professionals for both federal workforce needs and critical sectors of our economy, including energy and financial systems. The agencies also have a role to play in increasing the public's awareness of risk they may face in their everyday online activities and to help disseminate best practices for managing these risks. The language in the manager's amendment appropriately reflects the full scope of these critical activities, and once again, I thank my colleagues for working with me on this language. I do want to take a moment to express one concern that I have. Almost everyone in this room supports these programs. For the reasons that I outlined in my opening statement, I strongly support these programs. I think these programs are absolutely vital for our nation's future prosperity. And I think many, if not most of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle would agree with that. But I'm very concerned that we are moving forward on this bill without recognizing the funding situation facing the agencies we are tasking to address this issue. NSF and NIST and all the agencies tasked with responsibilities in this bill were hit with sequester, and those cuts will affect the ability of these agencies to implement the very responsibilities we are assigning them in this legislation. Cybersecurity is a critical issue, and it becomes more important by the day. Addressing this issue will not be easy, and it will not be cheap, but it is absolutely necessary. We need to recognize that and work towards finding resources to fix this problem. Chairman Smith and Chairman McCall have both worked with us in an amicable way on this bill, and I want to offer any amendments to address this. But I do think we need to acknowledge that we can't continually tell our agencies to do important work like this on the one hand and deprive them of the resources they need to do the job with the other hand. I yield back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Is there any further discussion on this
Mr. Chairman?
amendment? The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express my appreciation to you and to Mr. McCall for their willingness to work with me on this legislation, and thank Ranking Member Johnson for working to bring this up. I think this manager's amendment incorporates a lot of feedback from both sides of the aisle, and I wholeheartedly support the amendment. I think this is the way that we should be working. I know that the House passed the legislation twice, once in the Democratic majority 111th Congress and once in the Republican majority 112th Congress. Both times with broad bipartisan support. When we had a Democratic majority, this was the Lipinski-McCall bill. It is now the McCall-Lipinski bill. And I think that's the way this incredibly vital issue of cybersecurity should be handled. And I hope that this continues here today in the markup. As Mr. McCall stated, he did a good job of going through what this bill does. I think we should all take note, and it certainly bears repeating that the Director of National Intelligence this week said the danger of cyber attacks and cyber espionage on crucial infrastructure tops the list of global threats. And I believe that we face the possibility of a cyber Pearl Harbor that could destroy America's military and economic security. I mean, we've already seen the loss of countless jobs in this country through cyber espionage, and we have, thankfully so far, repelled much worse attacks that are happening every day. So I think it's now more important than ever that we get this legislation across the finish line, onto the President's desk. Just want to echo the one of the points that Ranking Member Johnson mentioned. I'd like to see higher authorization levels in recognition of the consequences if we fail in protecting our critical infrastructure. I understand what we have before us now is what we can do today, but I think it's important that we make sure we keep our eyes on that, and we do have enough support given to what is needed to protect our country. Of course, cybersecurity research standards and education are only part of the solution. I look forward to working with my colleagues to make sure this bill is included in any comprehensive cybersecurity legislation passed by Congress. So again, I want to thank Chairman Smith and Chairman McCall for working with me on this legislation. I urge the adoption of the Manager's Amendment and adoption of the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski, and appreciate your work on this bill, this being the third Congress you have done so. Are there any other members who wish to be recognized?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Maffei, then.
Mr. Chairman, shouldn't it be done by seniority? That's the only question. Okay. All right. Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. I totally agree and want to associate myself with the comments of Mr. Lipinski and the ranking member. And I also want to thank the chairman emeritus, and Mr. McCall, the chairman of the subcommittee. This is, as a new member of this committee, this is one of the most important things that we can work on at all. And in both my committee work here and on the Armed Services Committee, I will be trying to do that. There is broad bipartisan support. In fact, it was in October 2011 that the then congressional candidate Mitt Romney underlined the importance of cybersecurity when he made it one of the top 8 actions that he would have dealt with in the first 100 days. And his plan was, quote, a full interagency initiative to form a unified national strategy to deter and defend against the growing threats of these various cyber attacks. Mr. Lipinski mentioned the testimony of the intelligence, our top intelligence personnel, in saying that cyber attacks pose a greater risk potential to the United States national security than Al-Qaeda or other militants that we have focused on since 9/11. And of course, the President made news the other day when he mentioned that we have seen a steady ramping up of cybersecurity threats. Some are state-sponsored and some are just sponsored by criminals. I do also, though, believe that we might be being penny-wise but found foolish not to invest more in our cybersecurity. Normally, I would be the first person to say that this needs to be a very fiscally responsible bill, and of course, I do support it for being fiscally responsible. But there are some areas, and this is one of them. This poses extreme threats to our national security and our economy, and a threat, as Ranking Member Johnson said, to our future prosperity. So we should not be penny wise and pound foolish. That said, I will not offer an amendment today, and will fully support the bill and the manager's amendment, because the most important thing is that we do move forward. And I'm hoping that Mr. Swalwell, myself, and the other new members who certainly support this legislation will work to try to get through the log jams that you've faced in the past couple of Congresses, because this is just so vital to everything that we do. So again, I just want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for working in a bipartisan way on this. This is the way we should be doing all these issues, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Mr. Maffei, and thanks for reminding us about the President's and Governor Romney's support for this concept as well. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher, is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, number one, I want to thank you for your leadership in this issue, as well as the leadership that's been provided by several of the former chairmen, Chairman Hall, and others in this room that are joining us today. I've been trying to figure out what's being said here in the opening statements, because we all seem to agree that this is vital, an issue that's vital to our national security. But and we all seem to agree on that. But what we don't seem to agree on, and it seems this is quite often, is whether we need to, how much money we need to spend, or whether we need to spend more money on it. And it sort of dawned on me that what we're really talking about now is whether or not we need to borrow more money from China in order to protect us from China. Because every cent more that we spend now in increasing our deficit means we're going to have to borrow it from someone, and the people who are out giving us those loans happen to be the Chinese government. I would suggest that the threat that's posed to us by China will not be enhanced by us becoming even more indebted to China, and that we should also, when we're looking at trying to find solutions, we should go beyond trying to give scholarships to our people to defend ourselves against the Chinese students that we are educating in our universities and providing them insights into our most secret information, which then they go back to China and utilize to develop these cyber attack threats. I would think that maybe that, plus maybe the fact that we have permitted tech transfer and trade policies and investment policies that have built this enemy. And so while I'm totally supportive of this bill, I think we should start thinking about the fundamentals of how we get ourselves out of a predicament where we are actually in great debt now to a threat that we have created through our own policies in dealing with the world's worst human rights abuser, and that is the government of China. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Warbacher. The gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my good friend, Mr. McCall, Mr. Lipinski, for bringing this forward. I do believe that this is one of the single most important things that we will do during this Congress. Although I support our ranking members' concerns about the authorization levels, because I do think that the security threat is just that great. But nonetheless, I plan to support the bill. But I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the efforts, Mr. McCall and Mr. Lipinski, that you're doing to encourage cybersecurity education at all levels. It's vitally important that our universities and community colleges have the resources and expertise, and it's critical that we engage students at an earlier age to create the pipeline that we'll need to develop a competent cybersecurity workforce in the decades to come, particularly as Mr. Warbacher has just expressed. The National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education plays an instrumental role in this, and I'm glad that the committee will be supporting NIST in its efforts to coordinate this cybersecurity education. I also want to highlight the Maryland Cybersecurity Center, or MC2, for a unique approach to educating the future generation of cybersecurity workforce to serve industry and government needs in Maryland and the Washington metropolitan area. MC2 offers innovative hands-on educational programs to pre-college students, undergraduates, and graduate students. And I believe that by targeting as early as middle school and high school, and not just waiting to the university level, that we can stimulate early interest in the field of cybersecurity and provide students with a knowledge base and preparation to be successful in their future post-secondary studies and eventual career. And I look forward to continuing to work with our chairman and our ranking member on those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. The gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this markup, and I'm also pleased that on the agenda of my first markup as a member of Congress, as a startup member of Congress, is a bill to address the critical issue of cybersecurity. And I'm proud and feel fortunate to represent northern Silicon Valley in California, the heart of innovation, technology, computers, and the Internet for the nation and the world. Needless to say, protecting the integrity of computer systems and securing the information they contain is absolutely critical for our area. If we were to sneeze, the rest of the country could catch a cold. That's why it's so important to protect the infrastructure in Silicon Valley. An attack against companies in Silicon Valley will ripple across the country and the globe. As we know, this threat is very real. Networks are being attacked constantly by a variety of different actors and for different reasons. For example, there is evidence that Iran has targeted our financial institutions, and China is out to steal one of the best drivers we have of economic growth, our intellectual property. And I would dispute that this is just one country acting. I believe the evidence is clear. There are a number of nation states, and there are a number of individual criminal organizations from all over the globe who are seeking to attack our networks. Yesterday, in the other committee on which I sit, the Committee on Homeland Security, we discussed these and other issues at a hearing with Department of Homeland Security Deputy Secretary Janet Lute and other interested stakeholders. DHS acknowledges the need for federal legislation to enhance cybersecurity capabilities while still protecting privacy, and I'm looking forward to passing legislation to do that out of the Homeland Security Committee. Today, we're considering a piece of the cybersecurity puzzle, H.R. 756, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2013. This bill would help develop our capabilities for cyber defense by, among other elements, developing security standards and improving the collaboration among federal agencies for relevant research and development. I support this bill, and I encourage my colleagues to do so as well. I want to make 2 quick points. First, Section 107 requires a report from the President relating to the needs of our federal cybersecurity workforce. Among other items, the bill requires that the report include an analysis of any barriers to the federal government recruiting and hiring cybersecurity talent, including barriers relating to the compensation, hiring process, job classification, and hiring flexibilities. I want to be clear that any such discussion should encompass and explain the effects of the ongoing federal pay freeze and the sequester. Federal employee pay has been frozen since 2011, and that freeze is expected to continue this year. This sequester, as has been alluded to by the ranking member and others, threatens to hurt our capabilities in fighting cybersecurity. I believe the problem with the sequester is that when it's so indiscriminate and across the board, you target and cut. You do not target, but rather you cut some services that are very critical, and in many cases, there are services that should be cut more than what we're cutting them. For example, agricultural subsidies. If I had to weigh agricultural subsidies against protecting our cyber networks, I think it's clear, based on what the national security threat is, where we should be putting our money. Second, I strongly believe that our best solutions come from collaboration between all interested stakeholders, government, industry, academia, and so on. I ran for Congress with a deep desire to encourage public-private partnerships and collaboration, and I hope that we can do that with this bill. Section 103 requires a plan on how the Networking and Information Technology Research and Development program should best guide federal cybersecurity research and development. The plan already must include a variety of items, like goals for federal research and a description of how the program will establish a research infrastructure. As part of this process, the agencies involved should also be required to consider and include in the report how the program will foster the establishment of public-private partnerships that will result in research, technologies, and applications that will help us improve our cybersecurity defense. With such an important issue and in the area of tight budgets, we need to make the best and most effective use of our taxpayer dollars. This can be accomplished in part by combining the talents of the private sector, like the many technology companies in my district, and the government. Mr. Chairman, I hope you and the ranking member will consider adding such a provision to the bill when it passes the committee today. I look forward to working with you both on strengthening this bill before it makes its way to the House floor. And thank you again for holding this markup.
Thank you, Mr. Swalwell. Is there any further discussion? The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Brown, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I keep hearing my Democrat colleagues talking about the sequester and how devastating it's going to be. And I have a question for any one of y'all. Well, actually, 2 questions. Number 1 is who gave us the sequester? And number 2 is why? Can any of my colleagues, I'd be glad to yield a moment to answer that question. Ms. Johnson? She's sitting there not paying any attention. You talked about the sequester. Who gave us that sequester? I'd be glad to.
You were one of them that gave it to us.
No, ma'am, I did not vote for it. It's the sequester was given to us by our president, President Obama. He's the one who suggested it. He's the one who promoted it. And I keep hearing from my Democrat colleagues blame placed on the Republican side. But the long and short of it is that we're spending money that we cannot afford. As Mr. Rohrbach said, I keep hearing about wanting to plus up spending on many areas, and cybersecurity has been a big concern of mine for a long period of time, both in this committee as well as in the Homeland Security Committee, where I serve under the able chairmanship of my good friend McCall, Mr. McCall from Texas. And we need to be spending money on national defense. I agree with that. But to continue to harp about the sequester that y'all's president gave us the, let me finish my point. And to continue to hear my colleagues harp about the sequester when it was proposed by the president, it was promoted by the president. Nobody in the press seems to ask the president why he wanted to give us a sequester, and I think it was all about trying to raise taxes, and it wasn't to solve the economic problems that we face. We've got to spend money on what is important, and that's national security and things that the Constitution gives us authority to spend money on instead of spending money on things that we shouldn't be. Cybersecurity is certainly something that we should be spending money on just because it is a national defense, national security issue. But I'm just getting tired of hearing colleagues on the other side of the aisle continue to squawk about the sequester when it was our president, President Obama, who gave us a sequester. And for whatever reason, he has promoted that. For whatever reason that he suggested that, but it was his suggestion. The Congress voted on approving the sequester. I did not. I voted against it because I thought it was terrible policy, and we have the sequester, so let's just put our big boy pants on and go forward and do what we can do to try to keep this country economically safe as well as militarily safe. Mr. Chairman,
would the gentleman yield?
Certainly.
Thank you. I just want to just clarify, because in the interest of bipartisanship, and I think that the chairman has really conducted this this committee and this markup in that way, and I know the gentleman from Georgia, and I know that he actually did not mean to refer in that kind of disparaging way to the gentlewoman from Texas, the ranking member, and it would be great if you would, on the record, just make sure that we continue to express our points, but not do it in a way that disparages our committee leadership, either the chairman or the ranking member. And I'd appreciate it if you could just put that on the record.
Well, I was not disparaging Ms. Johnson by any means. I asked her a question and she didn't answer, and I just was trying to get her to pay attention. I know she was deep in thought, and if I offended her, I apologize. But the point is, continue to harp about a sequester that's in place. It was given to us by the president. We've got to stop spending money we don't have. We've got to be financially responsible as a Congress, and we're not being. And I just wanted to make my point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Could the gentleman yield?
Would the gentleman yield to the ranking member?
Certainly, I'd be glad to yield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that due to a personal relationship, I just really didn't pay Mr. Brown much attention. However, regardless of how we got here, we are here, and I think we have to keep it before us. At the same time, I think that we should put our nation's security ahead of that and continue to fund the areas that we need to fund for security, and to make sure that the agencies we're giving this responsibility have some way to carry out the responsibility. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. If there's no further discussion, the vote is on the manager's amendment. All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the manager's amendment is agreed to. We will now go to other amendments, and does the gentleman from California, Mr. Baer, seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 003, amendment to H.R. 756, offered by Mr. Barra of California.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized to explain his amendment.
My amendment today is simple. It asks we maximize the talent of our military veterans to continue to serve our country by recruiting and prepping veterans for the cybersecurity workforce. Our military men and women are heroes at home and abroad, bravely defending our country overseas and in our backyard. We trust our veterans with our lives every day, and I applaud and thank them for their service and duty to America. When they retire or leave the service, some of our best network specialists can help us continue to keep our nation secure. Who better than these men and women to protect our cyber and networking infrastructure? By finding ways to recruit and prepare veterans for the cybersecurity workforce, we can both protect ourselves and help our returning heroes. I urge my colleagues to adopt my amendment, which adds preparing veterans for the cybersecurity workforce to the Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Program. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Barrow. I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment and thank the gentleman for his addition to the strategic plan for the NIDRD program. I do support this amendment. Or is there anyone else who wants to be recognized? If not, all in favor of the amendment say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Does the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 057, amendment to H.R. 756, offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment explicitly adds community colleges to the list of qualified institutions for the Cyber Scholarship Program. There are two other parts of the bill that explicitly mention community colleges as part of academia and institutions of higher education. This is a conforming amendment to make this other section conform. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment, and I do want to thank the gentleman for the inclusion of community colleges in the Scholarship for Service program. As I say, I support the amendment. Is there anyone else who seeks recognition? If not, all in favor of the amendment say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Does the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Kilmer, have an amendment?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 002, amendment to H.R. 756, offered by Mr. Kilmer of Washington.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Washington is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To recruit and train the next generation of federal and private sector cybersecurity professionals, we need to leverage capabilities within higher education and create a pipeline that will produce the IT workforce that can help and enhance our nation's communications and information infrastructure. We need to ensure that the cybersecurity courses and degree programs being developed are effective and that they are producing individuals with the skills necessary for employment as cybersecurity professionals. To make sure that this is happening, my amendment calls for the NSF to support activities that evaluate the effectiveness of cybersecurity courses and degree programs. Additionally, it calls on NSF to support the establishment of public-private partnerships that will allow students to gain critical research experience on real-world problems as a component of their degree programs. Collaboration between academia, industry, and our students will help ensure our future workforce has the qualifications and skills necessary to strengthen America's national security and economic prosperity. I believe this amendment would further encourage students to seek a cybersecurity education and will strengthen the ability of the institutions to produce highly effective cyber professionals to join America's future workforce. Thank you for consideration of this amendment, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kilmer. I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment, and I thank the gentleman for offering it. It improves the ability of universities to produce cybersecurity professionals, so I think it's a good amendment. Are there any others who wish to be recognized? If not, all in favor of the amendment say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number.
Is this amendment number 56 or 54?
This should be 056.
Okay.
Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. Amendment number 056, amendment to H.R. 756, offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment, like the earlier amendment, is meant to harmonize different sections of the bill. This amendment clarifies language in the bill to ensure that the participation of women is encouraged in the federal cyber scholarship for service portion of the bill. Women are called out specifically on page 5 of the bill and on page 20 of the bill, but not on page 12 of the bill. This corrects that dilemma. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kilmer. Mr. Grayson, sorry, I'm one behind here. I recognize myself in support of the amendment. I, too, would like to see more women pursue cybersecurity degrees, so I support the gentleman's amendment. Are there any other members who wish to be recognized? If not, all in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. Does the gentleman have another amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have another amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment. And what number is this, Mr. Grayson?
I believe this is 58.
Okay, I thought perhaps you might
54.
not
There
offer
seems to
that.
be a
We'll go to
discrepancy.
54. Okay.
All right. On the list of amendments that I see, Mr. Chairman, I see the next one being 058. That's an amendment, well, in any event, not the amendment that you and I discussed, but a different one.
Okay, the clerk will report Amendment 54. Is that correct, Mr. Grayson?
If we're talking about Amendment 54, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to withdraw that amendment. Nope, sorry. It's the other way around. Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Okay, the clerk will report the amendment, and it's number 54.
Thank you. This amendment adds language to require, sorry.
That's fine. Amendment number 054, amendment to H.R. 756, offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Florida is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Sorry for the confusion on my part. What this amendment does is to add language to require NIST to carry out research associated with improving the security and integrity of the information technology supply chain as part of its intramural security research program on cybersecurity. Just by way of background, former U.S. counterterrorism chief Richard Clarke has said that all electronics made in China may have built-in trapdoors allowing Chinese malware to infect American systems on demand. The Fukushima experience has demonstrated to us the fragility of our supply chains, both technological and otherwise. It's an obvious potential target for cyber terrorism. Therefore, I respectfully ask that NIST be engaged in this regard and charged with the responsibility to carry out research to improve the security and integrity of the information technology supply chain. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment, and I appreciate the gentleman's addition of supply chain security and integrity management to NIST research activities. Is there anyone else who seeks recognition on this amendment? If not, all in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We will now go to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Wilson, for her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 002, amendment to H.R. 756, offered by Ms. Wilson of Florida.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlewoman from Florida is recognized to explain her amendment.
No. Mr. Chairman, this amendment will do exactly what the bipartisan witnesses at our recent cybersecurity hearing argued is necessary for our nation's cyber defense. It will advance scientific understanding of emerging threats to ensure that American businesses, government agencies, and citizens can take action for their own protection. As Dr. Frederick Chang argued before the subcommittees on technology and research, the discipline of cybersecurity today is too reactive and after the fact. To detect new attacks and vulnerabilities and develop solutions to defend against the identified risk, we need to develop what Dr. Chang and other esteemed witness, Ms. Terry Benzel, have termed a science of technology. The amendment at the desk calls on the director of the National Science Foundation and the director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology to support research that will lead to the development of a scientific foundation for the field of cybersecurity. This includes research to increase understanding of the underlying principles of securing complex network systems, to enable repeatable experimentation, and to create quantifiable security metrics. This research, which will draw on existing programs and activities, will go a long way toward developing a science of cybersecurity. This, in turn, will do a great deal to keep our businesses profitable and our citizens safe. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment. The gentlewoman's amendment supports research at NSF and NIST that establishes a stronger scientific foundation for cybersecurity. A firm science and engineering foundation providing metrics and repeatable testing methods, for example, will improve confidence in cybersecurity technologies and promote innovation. I support the amendment and encourage my colleagues to do the same. Is there any other member who seeks recognition? If not, all in favor of the amendment say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. I believe now we'll go to our last amendment, and that is being offered by the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 003, amendment to H.R. 756, offered by Mr. Peters of California.
Okay, without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from California is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The economic and national security of the United States depend on the reliable functioning of our critical infrastructure in the face of ever-changing cybersecurity threats. I'm offering an amendment today that takes steps to protect this infrastructure by creating a critical infrastructure cybersecurity framework. And I thank the chairman for bringing this bill and my colleagues from Texas and Illinois for leading this legislation. It's important that we work to enhance the nation's cybersecurity and improve our critical infrastructure. If our communication systems or power grid were to be hijacked and controlled by an enemy, it would be debilitating to our national security, our government, and the people we serve. This amendment directs the director of NIST to collaborate with the private sector to develop a voluntary framework that includes standards, guidelines, and best practices for reducing cybersecurity risk to critical infrastructure. The director would solicit input from not only the private sector, but also the federal agencies, state, local, and tribal governments. And the director of NIST would publish the framework 18 months after the enactment of the legislation. I want to emphasize that this framework is non-binding and not prescriptive. In fact, it's an opportunity not only to highlight and learn from the best practices of the private sector, but also for government information to augment the ability of private sector to defend its own networks. Cybersecurity and protecting our infrastructure is not a Democratic or Republican issue, it's a national one. So I'm approaching this need for such a framework with viewpoints from both sides of the aisle. In October 2011, the House Republican Cybersecurity Task Force put forth recommendations, which I have here, one of which was to create this voluntary critical infrastructure cybersecurity network framework led by NIST. The President's recent executive order on cybersecurity also directs the development of a cybersecurity framework. The framework is something, therefore, that both sides agree on and both sides agree needs to be done. And I want to emphasize that it needs to be done here in Congress, too, so that we have oversight through this committee, particularly through the Oversight Committee chaired by Mr. Brown from Georgia. There's an urgency to seek such a framework, to see such a framework as accomplished, and I agree with the majority task force that NIST is the ideal federal agency to carry out such an important task. It's a non-regulatory agency. It's well respected in the private sector. We can't make progress on cybersecurity without the vital input of the private sector, which is integral to our critical infrastructure. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment to improve our cybersecurity and protect our assets, and I yield back my remaining time.
Thank you, Mr. Peters. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, is recognized in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure Mr. Peters' intentions are good, this amendment directs NIST to seek input from the private sector when developing the critical infrastructure framework without ensuring that the director will use this input wisely. This has been a bipartisan process over the last several Congresses, but I'm concerned this amendment lacks specificity, which is why the U.S. Chamber of Commerce opposes this amendment, and they represent the private sector. Inclusion of this amendment would hurt the progress that has already been made and reduce the likelihood of finally getting this bill through the Senate and signed into law by the President. I think the private sector is dealing with this issue every day and has a great stake in the development of any guidelines or framework. Its role must be clearly defined so we do not risk losing the knowledge that these experts would bring to the table. We are currently exploring this also in the Homeland Security Committee in terms of voluntary standards being produced by the private sector with respect to critical infrastructures. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I stand in opposition and I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. McCall. Are there any other members who wish to be heard on this amendment? The gentlewoman from Maryland, Ms. Edwards, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to express my support for the amendment. It requires NIST to develop, in collaboration with the private sector, including the owners and operators of our critical infrastructure, a framework that will promote the adoption of voluntary standards and best practices to lower cybersecurity risks across all sectors and industries. The amendment implements Section 7 of the President's Executive Order on cybersecurity. Now, I know there are concerns that have been expressed that the framework will open the door for regulatory action by sector-specific agencies, but I want to reiterate that NIST does not intend to do so. Rather, this amendment would allow NIST to continue promoting the wide adoption of practices to increase cybersecurity across all sectors and industry types. The framework will seek to provide owners and operators a flexible, repeatable, and cost-effective risk-based approach to implementing security practices while allowing organizations to express requirements to multiple authorities and regulators. And with that, I yield and express support for the amendment.
Thank you, Ms. Edwards. Does anyone else seek recognition? The ranking member, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank the gentleman from California for this amendment. The national and economic security of the United States depends on a reliably functioning critical infrastructure. Tasking NIST with accelerating development of voluntary census-based standards through a public-private partnership is a common-sense approach to increasing the security and reliability of our critical infrastructure. In fact, the Republican Cybersecurity Task Force report stated that Congress should encourage participation in the development of voluntary cybersecurity standards and guidance through non-regulatory agencies such as the National Institute of Standards and Technology to help private sector improve security. The Congress's amendment implements this task force recommendation by requiring NIST to establish a public-private partnership that will bring all of the stakeholders together in the development of best practices and standards. This amendment will accelerate the adoption of a voluntary cybersecurity practices, and I urge its adoption.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. The question is on the Peters. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm reading the amendment, and I heard what the gentleman from Texas said, and I just don't see anything in this amendment that seems to require anybody to do anything or to impose any burden on the private sector. I don't mean to impose on the gentleman from Texas, but if the gentleman would be so kind, I will yield the time to you. Can you point to anything in the amendment that actually does what was described?
I believe that I'd be happy to take that. I believe that it lacks specificity in terms of what collaboration is supposed to take place, how the director is to use this input. Again, I think this poses a problem from the private sector. They do view this as a slope down the road to regulatory standards, which is why the U.S. Chamber of Commerce opposes this amendment. Having said that, I would be happy to work with the gentleman, Mr. Peters, on language if he'd be willing to withdraw the amendment.
I yield to Mr. Peters.
I had not intended to do that, but I am going to accept the gentleman's offer in the interest of bipartisanship. If Mr. Chairman, if I might just add.
Without objection, the amendment will be withdrawn. Thank you, Mr. Peters, and I know you and Mr. McCall will be able to try to work something out in that regard.
Mr. Chairman, I'm so happy that I could bring the two parties together, something that I'm famous for.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson.
That could be a first.
Yeah, just but we hope not the last, Mr. Grayson. Thank you. Let's see. Are there any other amendments? The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher.
I just would like to announce that I will be offering the following amendment to the Rules Committee to see if we can offer this on the floor, mainly because I did not offer this amendment 24 hours in advance of this hearing, which I think is par for the course, and I would need unanimous consent, and I doubt if I would get unanimous consent. So I'll be offering this at the Rules Committee, and the following amendment: no money provided by this legislation shall be used to finance scholarships, to be used in education programs that are open to foreign students who are citizens of a country that is recognized as a base of cyber attacks on targets within the United States. That will be an amendment that I will offer to the Rules Committee for their consideration, and I just thank you very much for allowing me to submit or suggest that today.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. If there are no further amendments or reporting quorum being present, the question is on reporting the bill as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table, and we will now go to our second bill of the day. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 756. 967, the Advancing America's Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Act of 2013, and the clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 967, a bill to the High Performance Computing Act of 1991 to authorize activities for support in networking and information technology research and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement and then the ranking member. I am pleased to call up for consideration H.R. 967, the Advancing America's Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Act of 2013. And I want to thank Ms. Lummis, the gentlewoman from Wyoming, for her work on this bill, and I am an original co-sponsor along with Ranking Member Eddie Bernice Johnson. This bill had broad bipartisan support in the last Congress, and I hope it will receive the same support today. In the digital age, protecting our nation's computer networking systems is more important than ever. This bill provides the coordinated R&D efforts necessary to improve cyber and data security nationwide. And better network security promotes U.S. competitiveness, enhances national security, and creates high-tech jobs. The NITRD program is an extension of the High Performance Computing Act of 1991. It represents the federal government's main R&D investment portfolio for unclassified networking, computing, software, cybersecurity, and related information technologies. Currently, 15 federal agencies are contributing members of NITRD, with an additional 20 or so participating in the program. This bill serves as the mechanism for interagency coordination of R&D to ensure no duplication of research efforts are among federal agencies or the private sector. It rebalances R&D portfolios to focus less on short-term goals and more on large-scale, long-term, interdisciplinary research. While this bill does not authorize specific funding amounts, NITRD spending totals over $3.7 billion annually. Over $1.1 billion of this is from the National Science Foundation, and over $550 million is from the Department of Energy. The bill updates the underlying high-performance computing statute and codifies work undertaken by the National Coordination Office housed within NSF to oversee the 15 different agencies. The NITRD program has 8 strategic priorities for its research: cybersecurity, autonomous robotic systems, high-end computing and applications, exascale computing, human-computer interaction, large-scale networking, workforce development, and software design and productivity. Technologies that come from these research priorities are applied by the commercial sector and the government to protect and enhance emergency communications, the power grid, air traffic control networks, and national defense systems. Networking and information technology supports and boosts American competitiveness, enhances national security, and helps strengthen the economy. American job creators also recognize the importance of networking and information technology research and development. Many industry partners and stakeholders have written letters in support of this bill. They include the National Association of Manufacturers, Tech America, Computing Research Association, Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers USA, Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, and the U.S. Public Policy Council of the Association for Computing Machinery. Cybersecurity provisions in the bill include research necessary to detect, prevent, and recover from actions that compromise or threaten computer-based systems. This will be the second cybersecurity-related legislation this committee is reporting today, and I again thank Ms. Lummis for her interest in this issue and urge my colleagues to support the bill. Are there any amendments to the bill? I need to put the list. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 013, amendment to H.R. 967, offered by Mr. McCall of Texas.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Texas is recognized to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, my amendment would simply add the Department of Homeland Security to the list of agencies in Section 101 of the High Performance Computing Act of 1991. The underlying act was written before DHS existed, and my amendment would ensure that the Department of Homeland Security, which plays a key role in securing the federal government's civilian cyber networks, is included with the other listed agencies as part of the ongoing cybersecurity efforts carried out under the authority of this act. I urge my colleagues to support this, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McCall. I support the amendment as well. Is there any other member who wishes to be heard on the amendment? If not, all in favor say aye. All opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Grayson, is recognized for the purpose of offering an amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 055, amendment to H.R. 967, offered by Mr. Grayson of Florida.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Florida is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment amends the National High Performance Computing Program to add a focus on improving the security, reliability, and resilience of computing and networking systems. Our cybersecurity infrastructure isn't just software, it's also rooted in the real world with physical vulnerabilities to terrorism and natural disasters like hurricanes and even just power outages. Late last year, an Amazon.com server problem in Virginia took down Netflix, which was a terrible problem for my 5 children. Reddit, Pinterest, Fast Company, Airbnb, and others. And this is just the most recent high-profile incident of this type. Given that our various power grids, telecommunication systems, server farms, and so on are all interconnected and physically connected, we need research on how to make these systems more resilient and reliable. That's what this amendment does. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Grayson. I support the amendment as well. Are there any other members who wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. We'll go now to the amendment to be offered by the ranking member, Ms. Johnson, and she is recognized for that purpose.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I do have an amendment at the desk.
And the clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 440, amendment to H.R. 967, offered by Ms. Johnson of Texas.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlewoman from Texas is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would simply update Section 4 of the bill to reflect activities that have already been carried out under a NIDA D program since the language was first introduced by Chairman Garden in 2009. At that time, experts from both academic and industry testified before the committee that the program take an active role in convening industry, university researchers, experts from national laboratories around the topic of cyber physical systems. And in 2007 review of the program, the PCAST also recommended that cyber physical systems get disproportionately larger increase in RSD funding under NIDA D. And cyber physical systems play an increasingly important role in such diverse fields as healthcare, transportation, and manufacturing. For example, a diabetic doesn't have to remember to take her insulin because an implantable device monitoring her glucose level is taking care of it for her. Or the pilot flying your plane doesn't have to take a manual control when the plane hits turbulence because the autopilot reads the conditions and responds in the safest way every time. Partnerships between industry and universities in this area of research are no less important than they were in 2009. Fortunately, OSTP and NIDA D program also recognized the need and responded to the PCAST and other expert input accordingly. They have taken significant steps since 2009 to address many of the needs identified in Section 4. However, it was premature to do away with the provision altogether because all of the problems are not yet solved, and PCAST continues to list it as a priority. So we updated the section to reflect that it has what it has done, but also to make sure that this continues as a priority focus. In particular, there is still a need to continue to develop new models for public-private partnership and to focus more on transferring new ideas out of the lab and into the commercial marketplace. In changing this provision from a fairly prescriptive task force to a less prescriptive workshop, we give OSTP the flexibility to design the workshop to meet current needs and also to work within their current mechanisms for convening stakeholders. It also saves them a lot of money, and in this, I hope Mr. Brown is listening. In this budget environment, even $1 million makes a big difference. This is a common sense, good government amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. I'll recognize myself in support of the amendment. Since the bill was originally introduced, the Office of Science and Technology Policy has created a coordinating group specifically for cyber physical programs. This bill replaces text that would have caused duplication of work already being done, so I support the amendment's inclusion and appreciate the gentlewoman's offering it. Are there any other members who wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the gentlewoman's amendment is agreed to. We will now go to what I understand is the last amendment of the day, and that will be offered by the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Bouchon.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment number 441, amendment to H.R. 967, offered by Mr. Bouchon of Indiana.
And without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Indiana is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a very simple amendment. In the years since the bill was originally drafted, the use of cloud computing has become a more common way to store and share information of all kinds. This amendment directs federal science agencies to examine how they can facilitate the use of cloud computing for federally funded science and engineering research. I yield back.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Bouchon. Are there any other members who wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, all in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the gentleman's amendment is agreed to. If there are no further amendments and a reporting quorum is present, the question is on reporting the bill as amended favorably to the House. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it, and the bill as amended is ordered reported favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Before we adjourn, I just want to thank all members for being here today. This is a really good turnout. I appreciate the fact that we have now marked up 2 bipartisan bills. We've gotten off to a good start, and I thank all members on both sides of the podium here for their support today. If there's no further discussion, that completes our business. It concludes the full committee markup, and the committee stands adjourned.